Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Marin Economic Briefing. My name is Mike Blakely, and I am the CEO of the Marin Economic Forum. We are a nonprofit public benefit organization providing research and advisory on all things related to the Marin County economy. You can find out more about our work and make sure that you can sign up for events like these by visiting our website at www.marineconomicforum.org. So welcome to this morning's economic briefing. Like many of you, we took the summer months off, but we are back now with a fresh set of data. In fact, the last couple of weeks, there's been some key economic data, particularly at the macro level, issued, and we are pleased to share that with you this morning. With me, as always, is the MEF Chief Economist, Dr. Rob Eiler, who is going to take us through some of the key data as mentioned, that was released last week. For this briefing, we wanted to try to focus a little bit more on the indicators around the employment issue. As is the story nationally, but also here in Marin County, hiring has become extremely difficult for our employers with really no end in sight. And so we wanted to kind of focus the data a little bit on that point. I'll just remind everybody that these monthly briefings are intended to provide just the key data that we look at as we try to understand what's happening in the economy at the national, state, and of course the local level. We've opened our format to encourage people to ask questions in advance because we keep this to a very short 30-minute briefing at the beginning of the week. We want to let you get on with your day. So I do encourage you for next month's briefing to think about some questions that you might have and send those in advance to us so that we can address them. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to our Chief Economist, Rob Eiler, who's going to share with you some data. And then as usual, I'll come back after Rob's done talking and talk a little bit about how we're seeing things here in the local economy at MEF. So Rob, good morning. Over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning, folks. Should be able to see my screen now. I wanted to walk through some basic indicators, as Mike suggested, just sort of give you a flavor of what we're looking at and also what's been going on in the macro economy as well as the local economy. So I want to start with just kind of a quick overview. The US economy continues to sort of slowly truck along, which a lot of economists expected to sort of see this first burst out of recovery and then a flattening period as the labor market was sorting itself out, as Mike suggested. The local hiring issues are generalized across the United States, and part of that is a mix of reticence to go back to work on the part of some folks. COVID cases rising, which is reducing demand forecasts a little bit, which has slowed down hiring. The fade of unemployment insurance benefits that were augmented and extended. All that stuff has sort of led to a slower growth rate of jobs at the US level, even though the unemployment rate at the US level is now 5.2% seasonally adjusted. Right now, the Federal Reserve at least is considering not raising interest rates probably until late next year or early 2023, but so much of that depends on the evolution of prices vis-a-vis the forecasts that the Fed have in place, and then ultimately the continuation of our labor market growth toward what they believe is, in a sense, the maximum employment level of the American economy. At the California level, we saw jobs flatten out a little bit. We did see more hiring. We saw a little bit of a fade in the unemployment rate, but not by much in August. These data actually just came out on Friday morning. As Mike suggested, they were very, very fresh. But we're still about 965,000 people down from where we started in January 2020, with the idea that January 2020 is sort of our benchmark date with respect to when the beginning of the labor market slide began. The Los Angeles metro area is one of the biggest drags on the California economy. They're still at 9.7% unemployment, and a lot of that's based on what's been going on in leisure and hospitality, specifically in the LA basin. As you can see, that number there is still 21% down from January 2020 levels, seasonally adjusted, with respect to the leisure and hospitality industry sector in the California economy. And even though we've seen some recovery over summer, hiring has not been quick back up to pre-COVID levels just yet. If we look at the US economy, our normal way of doing this is to show the Great Recession evolution against the most recent recession and recovery, with the idea that we're really trying to compare as best we can apples to apples to give you a sense of where we are in the recovery and ultimately, hopefully, the expansion path. This is the evolution of the US economy with respect to the Great Recession talking about the volume of workers at the national level. So if we start in November 2007 at 100, because the volume of workers has changed from these two recessions, we can see this long, sort of drawn out bowl effect, where 78 months later, we got back to where we started in November 2007. The COVID-19 recession showed an immediate jump once recovery started, but then, which most economists knew was coming, there would be a flattening period where labor market so-called frictions would start to kick in, and those frictions were numerous. Childcare issues, school closures, need to be home, unemployment benefits that were augmented and extended, reticence to go back to work, all that mixing together with some proportions to flatten out the recovery period a little bit more than a pure V-shaped recovery. And you can see that number means that we're 96.7% back to the seasonally adjusted volume of workers in the United States where we started in January 2020. So in some ways, we have surpassed where we were in terms of the number of months after the Great Recession, but the flattening effect has started to kick in. So instead of sort of having a recession where you turn the lights off, turn them back on again, and basically nothing's changed when the lights go back on, we're now starting to see some of the vagaries of how sharp the recession was in terms of playing itself out, including the lingering effects of COVID-19 on the labor market. But good things are happening in trend. We need to get that black line above the red dotted line to really feel like we've recovered. The forecasts since the last time we saw you have flattened out a little bit, but not a lot. So I'm going to move through these relatively quickly, but these data are as of about mid-August. And the way to read these is that for real GDP growth, which think is the income growth after inflation in the US, percentage-wise looking back 1 year annualized, and then the unemployment rate on the far right-hand side, the first column of data is what the previous quarter's forecast was. The second column is the new quarter. So the Philadelphia Federal Reserve surveys 40 economists who basically concentrate on forecasting the US economy. And this is what it looks like in terms of the new forecast over the next few quarters. So they're expecting 6.8% growth this quarter annualized, then on through relatively strong growth quarter on quarter, moving through the middle of next year. So a lot of this is now getting us back to what you could think of as a pre-COVID normal. And then the unemployment rate is slowly streaming down to basically where we were pre-COVID. So most economists now believe that the US economy will be back at pre-COVID conditions by the end of 2022. We will see if that actually plays out. At the annualized level, relatively robust growth, 6.1% this year. But notice, if you notice the column to the left of that shaded area at the bottom, it said 6.3 last or the previous quarter. So there was a little bit of a downgrade for 2021. And some of that is because the labor market is not growing as robustly as expected, is growing. But notice that in the unemployment rate, it's kicked back up a little bit. Those two are naturally tied to each other, just 0.1%, but a little bit of a slowdown from where economists saw it just 3.5 months ago. They now think it's going to be not as robust, but these are still very, very strong numbers historically in terms of getting back to pre-COVID levels in the labor market. So the sum of these parts is all good. The Congressional Budget Office that had its forecast update in July and is about to release another one here in the next few weeks basically corroborates where we're going with one little twist. And the twist is that one of the things about after 2022 and 2023, growth is going to be a little slower. And the supposition there is that the labor force is not going to grow as fast. Part of that is the gray wave, so-called baby boomers finally making the choice to walk away from the labor market. How true that is an open question. But also inflation should slow down after this year. And we're already starting to see the seeds of that slowdown, though a lot of that depends on how we move through smoothly on COVID cases worldwide and we don't have any supply chain seizures. Just a real quick note on inflation. One of the things economists are watching very closely is to see if there's supply side inflation pressure or demand side inflation pressure. If inflation's coming, we'd rather have it be demand side. It's much more manageable than supply side. Okay, context is good. The forecasts basically have not changed that much over the last 3 or 4 months, which is great given all the volatility in our economy in terms of seeing COVID cases rise and to a certain extent, employers getting a little bit more nervous about hiring. What I'm going to do now is move relatively quickly through the local indicators, starting with a very similar picture to the US data we saw before. This is Marin County. You can see kind of a similar shaping, about 95% home. This is people that live in Marin County who have a job or not. This is who has a job, 95% back to where we started January 2020. So it took about 58 months for the Great Recession to play itself out, and that we've seen some recent revisions of data. And as I said, we're about 95% home. So we need that black line, just like in the last picture that looked like this with the US economy, to get above that red dotted line to truly just get back to square. But one of the things we're watching, and I'll show you in a minute, is the evolution of the labor force, because even if you get back to the same volume of workers, is it the same mix of workers? Are there specific industries that will remain kind of a drag on the local economy? Let's see. Like I said, we need to get that black line over the red line. This is the latest data in a summary form for Marin County versus California. So this kind of gives you a snapshot of where things are. We're still down in labor force, like I just suggested, and we're going to see another picture of this in just a second. We're still down in overall employment, about 4.1% locally in Marin County. The state's about 5.2% down from where we were in January 2020, I'm sorry. But the key here is whether or not we're going to necessarily get back to those pre-COVID volumes of workers anytime soon. And that's kind of the big $64 question for even including the macro economy, is what's it going to take, and is there going to be specific industries that are going to remain a drag? So one of the things that's very concerning is the shifting labor force. And that's true for two major reasons. One is people left the labor force maybe permanently and moved on to something completely different, which means they may not come back to the jobs they had pre-COVID. The second is they left the area. So that's not as big a deal, though it's sort of a growing, sort of hand-wavy policy concern for California overall. But for local economies, especially relatively high cost of living ones, whether or not we've seen an out-migration of workers is one of the biggest things for local employers to watch. Okay, so this is the picture of the evolution of the labor force dynamics. So this is what it's looked like from the first cut in labor force, meaning that when jobs really seized up and the economy looked like it was really going to take a downturn, we saw people exit the labor force. Some of that is people moving away from the local area, but this is also true for California. So you can see this is where we went from Marin County. We saw a sharp cut, which is kind of classic in the beginnings of recession, to just a little under 10% fewer people that were available for work or working in the Marin County economy that lived in Marin County. Down hard, California down a little harder, a lot harder, but then sort of having the same evolution back up, but still below where we started January 2020. So if you're looking to gain access to the same volume of workers, it is nice to have the same volume of workers available in terms of either working or looking for a job to get back there. So that's the tie together between the employment level and ultimately the labor forces. Are there going to be the same number of people? And if not, will we have the same volume of commercial activity that generates incomes for everybody in Marin County? So we know that there's some sustained changes. We need to watch that. And the change in the unemployment benefits may cause a little bit of a quick pickup in these numbers toward that red dotted line. And that's critical. So while we might see that pickup, the one thing to watch for, and don't freak out, is if unemployment insurance benefits fading in their augmented and extended sense creates more people coming back into the labor force, because there's sort of people who were on the fringe who may not have been counted and were doing other things, but now that there's really no other place to go, they suddenly feel like they got to get competitive and get out there for the jobs that are there before everybody else moves into those positions. It could kick up the unemployment rate for a little while, but if we truly have a demand side problem, meaning that employers are struggling to find workers, that should clean itself up over the next 6 or 8 months. We will see. This number still has got to move back up above that red dotted line to feel like we can actually get back to the same volume of workers regardless. Okay, let's look at the industrial breakdown. So the jobs mix, we'll see in a minute, things have gone pretty good for most of the industries in terms of recovery, but I'm going to walk you through this relatively slowly just to make sure that what this graph is saying. What this graph is saying is that this is the percentage change in the number of workers by industry starting in April 2020 as compared to January 2020, and kind of moving quickly through the latest data, which just came out Friday, which is August 2021. So you can see that in April 2020, there were cuts across almost every single industrial sector, except for farming. We actually saw that kick up. And some of that was because we're counting a little bit more on the cannabis side in terms of workers in those categories. And the number of farm workers is relatively small. So 25 or 30 new workers can move that number up and down pretty rapidly. It's just an anomaly in the data given the way that Marin County's farm workers are counted. But notice almost every other category is negative. Then by 1 month later, we actually saw a kick up almost completely across the board. And then by December, we actually had some growth of certain industries, specifically in transportation and warehousing, as more of our lives became delivery at home online. Then in May, continued recovery. So then we're moving through spring 2021, June, July, and then the latest data, which is August. So two items here. One, leisure and hospitality, you can see has really recovered. And we're going to see one more graph on this before I close my comments in just a second. But if you move back toward the left-hand side, you'll see construction and manufacturing have both picked up to ultimately have now recovered completely and now are in potentially growth since pre-COVID numbers. So that's good. Those two goods producing industries are a really good sign in terms of the economy in Marin County generating relatively high wage jobs, even in the aftermath of what's happened. But if you go back to the far right-hand side, other services and government still around or beyond 10% cuts from January 2020. How much of that is retirement? How much of that is shifting labor force? It's an open question, which unfortunately might take another 12 months for the data to reveal themselves as to what really has happened in terms of outbound migration, retirement, or other issues. However, generally speaking, if you look from what we talked about above and you look at this with respect to the context from the national and state economy and what's been going on, Marin County is going through a classic positive recovery period as it has in the last three recessions, really kind of a stalwart economy in the Bay Area overall. Okay, and you can see that far right-hand side now. I'm sorry to shade that earlier. I wanted to show you something with respect to leisure and hospitality before I hand it back over to Mike. This is the evolution of occupancy rates in hotels. And Marin County has actually been an amazing story in terms of recovery. Notice that this is from May 2019. You can sort of see the seasonal downturn toward the end of 2019, a little bit of a pickup, which made 2020 look really good until we saw the seizure happen. And then you could see a sharp fall down to some really historic lows. In terms of by April 2020, we just basically had walked away from staying at hotels. Then we saw a decent climb back up during summer, another sharp downturn as we entered 2021. But then we've been on this nice steady climb all year as the economy has reopened. 78.8% by the end of July in terms of occupancy rates at Marin County's hotels and motels. Here's Napa. Napa has had a really good recovery period. And if you actually are in downtown Napa, you'll see that right away. But they're down still from where we were 2019. So this is one of the things that's got some concerns in the North Bay economy is how sustainable are our smaller hotels, motels, and the concentric circles around that industry in terms of being supported by visitors. Here's San Francisco. This is a huge story because we just haven't got back to a lot of conferences and a lot of business travel. So the occupancy rates remain relatively low in a structural sense. And Sonoma County looks like the rest of the North Bay. So what this story tells, at least in theory, is it tells a story of recovery in an industry, and we saw that in the jobs data. But we should expect that the Delta variant is going to slow down some of this occupancy growth, and probably into September and October, it'll start to fade a little bit, analogous to what we've seen in the last couple of years once we turn the corner around August and September. The one thing we were also concerned about is how much the movement around San Francisco and not having people come inbound actually does slow down what real economic growth and economic potential there is in visitors Bay Area wide. So we're watching that, even though there's been really nice pace in the North Bay, how much of that is regional travel versus, let's say, international travel, and how much that reduces the overall capacity in this part of the economy is a big concern. So what I want to do is I want to hand it back over to Mike, and there's a lot of stuff happening at MEF. So Mike, take it away.
Thanks so much, Rob, for your presentation. I want to pick up on a couple of points you made about the labor force, and I would certainly agree that that is the key thing that we're watching here. This, of course, many viewers will remember was an issue pre-pandemic. So, once again, we're in this situation now where businesses, particularly those that are looking for the lower skilled workers, which were challenged to find the right volume of workers anyway. Once again, now they're having a very, very difficult situation. In the past week, I've talked to a lot of different restaurant owners. As a matter of fact, that's such a key sector here in Marin. And, they're as one could expect, quite cynical about it. They're certainly being as creative as possible, as are other employers, trying to lure workers and retain workers, frankly. But the reality is that this is something that's going to continue to constrain growth. So you mentioned a couple of things about people leaving jobs or leaving the area. Now, although we didn't present it here, there are indicators on things like population growth and migration. Is there anything top of mind to you that you know about Marin's case with I think we saw, for example, the number of households increasing, but population decreasing in Marin. Is that what you recall? And how might that affect the labor force?
Yeah, so Mike, that's a great question. That's the latest data, at least putting the ones we have together. Unfortunately, we don't have two data sources that actually tie those two necessarily to each other, but that's what we're getting from two different sources. What it means for the labor force, unfortunately, is that you may have more people leaving than coming in, which naturally, in a sense, caps off the population possibilities with respect to labor force participation. So that's something we are watching, is that if we have a structural shift in the nature of how we're forming households in Marin County, we may also have a structural shift in the way that we have available labor force.
Yeah. And then following up on that, you talked about how commercial activity would need to pick up the slack. And I was wondering if you could just expand on that a little bit for our audience. Are you suggesting that the number of employees or number of jobs may not come back, but if the overall economic activity in the economy ramps up, then that will compensate for any potential loss of economic growth because we can't find workers?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird catch-22. So historically speaking, because most of the economy is driven by the number of workers working inside of it based on, let's say, the multiplicative effects of people earning a wage or salary and then spending it, we may see it now a shift toward where we're actually getting slightly better productivity per worker because we've shifted more toward the use of capital versus labor. So one of the things we're watching very closely is that will businesses look to say, look, I need to get back to the same revenue level and I might have to make an investment in a machine versus a person if I can't find the people. And this is kind of a microcosm of the idea of automation, even though automation's been with us for decades. But there may be more of a move toward artificial intelligence, maybe reducing your office staff by one person and replacing it with a chatbot. That kind of stuff, when it starts to aggregate, becomes a little bit more of a change in the labor force that looks like it's structural. And what that might mean is we may get the same amount of income, but we won't have the same number of workers. So we're watching that closely. The hope is that once we see labor force rise up and employment rise up, we've gotten back to the same number of workers. That gives us the inkling that the amount of commercial activity that was there pre-COVID should be very close to coming forward when the data start to show up. But that trade-off is something we're watching closely because we have slowdown in hiring. We then have to look at the income numbers, and if income is rising versus a slowdown in hiring, it likely means there's more businesses that are looking at automation or the use of capital instead of hiring.
Yeah, it's a great point because I think, a lot of people that are tuning in right now can probably, associate with what they've seen at their local restaurants. Not so much on the automation front, but restaurants around here and across the country have been changing their business models to deal with a lower number of workers, whether it's QR codes and ordering up at the counter or other. You're seeing that innovation occur, which is, what you would expect out of entrepreneurs. So let me turn a little bit right now to a couple of points. The prevailing question ever since the pandemic has hit has been, when will we get back to normal? And I can remember back the early days when economists like Rob and organizations like ours were trying to predict, what type of recovery, what shape of recovery we're going to have. V shape? Is it going to be like a Nike swoosh? The bottom line is economic forecasting is hard. But nonetheless, that is what we have people like Rob for and organizations like MEF. And so one of the things that occurred to me a couple of weeks ago was, for most of this year, economists have been pointing to the fall as the point in time where not only the recovery would be sustained, but there'd certainly be a lot more certainty in understanding when we would get back to normal. The idea being that, look, schools will be reopened, kids will be back. That will free up parents to be able to go back to the offices themselves, whether in San Francisco or even here in Marin County. We're looking at the fall as the time to reopen, even if a hybrid model, but they were expecting to welcome back workers. It was also figured at that time that, everything happening in the supply chain would start to work itself out. And really, Labor Day was sort of like this line of demarcation of, after that, everything's going to start getting better. In fact, if you Google economy and turn the corner, you'll find a number of articles from economists that really were pointing to the fall as the time where we really do turn that corner and get everything looks, as it should be in terms of a recovery. But at the same time, I heard a fascinating interview with an economist who said, we're in this era of the I don't know economy. And when you start to look at some of these key things we're trying to figure out, when are people going to come back to work? Or when is a hiring thing going to be figured out? When are prices going to come down? Or when are these supply chain disruptions, going to happen? When are mask mandates going to come down? Or when is everybody going to be vaccinated? All these things that we thought we would be able to have some visibility on in the fall just aren't occurring to a point where we feel, at least some of us feel very confident in saying when this is going to happen. Now, you heard Dr. Eiler talk about economists now looking at this kind of full recovery. I think, Rob, you said by the end of 2022, but we'll see, right? And so the Delta variant has certainly been disruptive, but it's not the only factor. So really what I'm trying to emphasize here is, while many of us look to this fall as a time where things will be getting better, the reality is we just don't know when some of these things that are making life difficult for us now are actually going to change for the better. And so that is why we continue here at MEF to look at these indicators whenever they become available. The monthly briefing series is, after our summer break, back on right now. And of course, through our newsletters, we're trying to keep you informed. But we understand there's a lot of information that people don't have. Businesses, it's very difficult to operate with uncertainty. And so we ourselves are going to be continuing to put out data as frequently as we can. And we sympathize with folks because there's not a lot that we can tell. Rob, I don't know if you have an opinion there. You're an actual economist, but this is how definitely what MEF's evidence over the last couple of months as it relates to here in Marin County has been. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, my comment, Mike, thank you, is that if you look at the forecast I gave you for the US economy, at least the one that a lot of economists kind of point to as the bellwether forecast, one of the things that we've seen is while there's been small adjustments, there has not been a sharp adjustment. So economists right now have sort of bet on the idea that we are going to turn the corner this fall, and that what we're going through right now is just sort of the anomalies and issues dealing with the sociopolitics around vaccines, and ultimately everybody will sort of get on board or herd immunity will happen. But forecasters have not said we are going to have a sharp downturn again. They do not expect a return to April and May 2020 throughout this next, let's say, 3 or 4 years. So while we don't know with precision how we're going to move through this, we feel relatively confident that socially and politically we will move through this. It unfortunately might mean a lot of volatility along the way. But to your point, Mike, we just don't know. So especially on the supply side issues, because we're sort of, the flattening of the world over the last 20 years means we're much more dependent on East Asia. If East Asia has an issue and we have supply chain seizures, that's going to change a lot of the forecast relatively quickly, even though we in the United States may not have social policies that are restrictive. Other countries that do could easily affect our ability to move forward.
Absolutely. So, confirmation from our chief economist there that there is a lot that we don't know, but the good news is we're not expecting any sharp reverting back to other things. And so we're going to keep plugging away, keep pushing the rock up the hill, as they say. One last point I want to finish on this morning is many of you are probably already aware of this, but for those that aren't, MEF is partnering with the County of Marin, and we have just launched an effort to produce something called the Marin Economic Vitality Strategic Plan. This is, in a nutshell, an economic plan for the County of Marin, where one has never really existed before. So this is a big moment in the time of Marin's economy, because this proactive sort of planning process that we're now embarking on is ideally going to set us up for defining what our future economy is going to look like, and in the next 5 years or so. So it's a really exciting opportunity that MEF is leading with the county. Many of you are, not only aware of it, but will have the opportunity to participate, because any economic strategy, any regional economic strategy, is really only credible if it's got enough input from its residents who it intends to serve. And so I want to put on everybody's radar that in the next few months, we're going to be working on this process and reaching out to all the different stakeholders in the county. But again, it's a very exciting opportunity. The plan is really going to deal with two things. It's going to deal with our more shorter term economic recovery and what kind of support can we, the county and jurisdictions, provide to their businesses to help them get back to that recovery. That's the key first part. But the second part is really this economic visioning exercise that we're going to go through, where we have the chance to say, look, here's what we know, here's what we want our economy to be and how it should serve our residents. That process is underway and it's really exciting. And I think in the early part of next year, we're going to see that plan materialize. So I wanted to get it on everybody's radar because everybody's going to have a chance to participate in this. And with that, we're going to wrap it up for today. Thanks again so much for tuning in. Please spread the word. As always, we like to use this opportunity to inform as many people as possible. Share our subscription links with your friends and colleagues, and do think about some questions for us on the next one. We'll be happy to take them. So I'm going to close it out there on behalf of Dr. Eiler, our Chief Economist. Thanks so much for tuning in and enjoy your week.